welcome to my coronavirus classroom. I'm Janessa Jacobs, and this is the endocrine system. So, the endocrine system is one of our two major controllers in the body. The nervous system is the fast controller that takes care of really short-term homeostatic variables. And, as quick as you can think about it, you can contract a muscle. Your endocrine system is the other controller that controls longer-term homeostatic variables such as growth and reproduction, so things that take a lot longer. The effects of the endocrine system are a lot more widespread. The targets are all over the body. So as kind of a place to start, let's have an overview of the endocrine system as a controller, and we'll compare it to the nervous system. So we'll say that it is the second major controller, or the second major control system. And if we were comparing the endocrine system to the nervous system, as far as the way that the two systems are working, they're both using chemical messengers. The endocrine system is using chemical messengers called hormones. The nervous system is using chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. And if we think about where neurotransmitters are released, we talked about that in the first semester. We said that neurotransmitters were released across a short distance called a synapse. So that means that the effect of a neurotransmitter is pretty short distance. And it's also very, rapid and also kind of short in duration. So neurotransmitters, these are short distance signals. They are short-lived. And they are pretty rapid to see the effect of a neurotransmitter once it binds its receptor on whatever that neuron is synapsing onto. Hormones are going to be released from a gland into the blood, which means that hormones can go over the entire body. They are long-distance signals. The effects are long-lived. So think about the difference between testosterone and estrogen. Testosterone thickens the larynx and causes deepening of the voice and causes increased facial hair development, things like that. Estrogen causes increased adipose deposition at the mammary and coxal regions. Coxal? And so if you think about it, the effects of endocrine system or of our hormones are long-lived. So we've got longer lasting effects. And they're also widespread. So since this is entering the blood, any cell in the body that has a receptor for a hormone is going to be a target. Longer lasting effects, and they're kind of shorter, with the exception of epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are synergizing with your sympathetic nervous system, if you recall from last semester. With the exception of that, hormones kind of take a little bit longer to see the effect of as well. So they're not as rapid as neurotransmitters are. So kind of stay slower to cause response. You might bind a hormone and immediately release another hormone, but that hormone is going to take some time to get to you and things, where the neurotransmitter is crossing a much shorter distance, and so the effects are rapid. You also have rapid removal of the signal when neurotransmission is done. Neurotransmitters get enzymatically broken down or reuptaken by neurons. Our hormones have an effect as long as they're in the system. So they can take a while. The half-life of a hormone is going to determine really how long it's floating in the blood, but there are a lot of things that can kind of impact that. We could say that they have longer, what do I want to say? Well, that's enough. What else? If we think about it, the effectors of hormones can be anything with a receptor, so any cell type in your body, in theory, can respond to a hormone. For our neurotransmitters, really the only effectors that are stimulated by neurotransmitters are muscles, it could be skeletal, cardiac, or smooth, glands, or other neurons. So So really, the nervous system is really good for tight, like fast control at some very specific spots. The endocrine system is really good for widespread control all over the body. They definitely work together all the time to keep you in homeostasis. It's just the type of homeostasis is different. Nervous system is controlling really short-term homeostatic variables, making really rapid changes. Endocrine system is controlling more long-term homeostatic variables. Again, growth. How long did it take you to get to be as tall as you are? You know? It was a long time. At least probably 14, 15, 16 years, right? How long does it take to reproduce? Well, I mean, if you look at the development of a reproductive system, again, that takes years and years and years. And then once you have two fully developed reproductive systems, reproduction itself, which is controlled in large part by hormones, is also very kind of long gestation. So both of them are very important, both of them are working together. A lot of people only think of the nervous system as a controller, probably because that's what you can feel. You can feel the effects of wiggling fingers and things because of your nervous system. It's harder to feel the effects of the endocrine system, but it's just as important. And honestly, I don't know, I kind of like it better, maybe because it's where I fell in love with teaching. But also, like, the nervous system and the immune system don't really ever talk to each other. So if, like, your nervous system is shielded and protected from your immune system, if you get nerve damage, then your immune cells will start actually attacking your nervous tissue because they've never seen it. So the nervous system can't interact with the immune system, but your endocrine system can. So endocrine system is definitely all over the place. All right, last semester when you were talking about epithelial-derived structures, you talked about glands, and we introduced you to two types. Exocrine glands that release their product into a duct to the external environment. So exocrine glands have ducts. These are ducted, and these ducts are going to empty onto an epithelial surface. So exo, to the external environment, exo, outside. Endocrine glands, endo, within, crine, secrete, chemical message. Endocrine glands are ductless glands, and they're discrete organs, and there are also endocrine tissues, but endocrine glands are discrete organs that release their product into the blood. So, ductless glands that secrete hormones into the blood. Okay? Beautiful. All right, so hormones are chemical messengers. All right, lots of stuff are chemical messengers. We have different types of chemical messengers, and they're going to be able to convey different distance messages. So hormones are long-distance signals that are being released from an endocrine gland into the blood, traveling through the blood to bind a receptor on some distant target and having an effect. So these are endocrine signals that are long distance, and what it is because we have a gland emptying into the blood. And your blood travels over your entire body. So if you think about a hormone, the sending cell is going to produce the hormone and drop it into your blood. So like, I don't know, this could be like a river. There's a guy sitting here, and he's waiting, and this guy drops the message in, and it goes a long way away, and then this guy picks up the message. What makes this guy able to pick up the message is that he's got a receptor for it. So just as receptor specificity was important in neural transmission, receptor specificity is important in target cell response to hormones. So, all right, our sending cell will release our hormone into the blood. It'll travel a long distance, and you know it's a federal violation to open anybody else's mail. You can only respond to this message if you've got the right address. Okay, autocrines. Autocrines, crine is like a signal or a chemical message, and auto is self. So this is like a self message. This is like a message to self, or a note to self. And we'll see this when we talk about immune cell activation. activation. The next type we'll also see an immune cell activation, but we're talking about chemical messengers now, which is why we're talking about this. So autocrines would be like, oh, the cell who has to make the message. It's like note to self. And so what happens is an autocrine will be released from a cell and come back and bind to a receptor on that cell's surface and cause an effect. So the autocrine will bind a receptor on the releasing cell and cause an effect. All right. The third type of signaling that we have is called paracrine signaling. Para means near, and crine signaling, message, chemical message. Paracrines are like a message to everybody in the neighborhood. So paracrines bind receptors on neighboring cells. So these are released by one cell and bind receptors on neighboring cells. So it's not entering the blood, it's not going a long distance away, it's staying in the, this message is staying in the interstitial fluid, and it's binding to receptors on neighboring cells. And again, we'll see this in immune system activation. So if we've got this cell, and he's got like a memo, if you're in the area, if you're in the office, you can respond to this memo, but if you're in some other office, you're not going to respond to this memo. Why is this important? Well, if you're a virus-infected cell, then you can tell the neighboring guys, I've got a virus, and then this one can be like, oh, virus, and it can upregulate its antiviral proteins, okay? So we'll talk again more about that later, but we're talking about chemical messengers right now, and these are the ones we have. Neurotransmitters are part of a group called neurocrines. We've got neurotransmitters and neurohormones. So there's a fourth type, neurocrine signaling, I'll just write it down real quick, we'll just be aware of it. So neurocrine, neuron, and these can be either neurotransmitters, which again are going to be short distance, or neurohormones, which are, chemically speaking, kind of long distance. Anatomically speaking, it's a short distance. But yep, those are the two types of neurocrines. Neuro, released by a neuron, chemical signal. Okay. Hormones is what we really want to talk about because this is the endocrine system where we have glands that are releasing hormones into the blood. So for our hormones, first we need to consider their chemical classification, and that's going to tell us some things about how they behave. So we either have hormones that are based on amino acids or hormones that are based on cholesterol. And so the solubility is going to change depending on which one you're looking at. And it's also going to determine then how that hormone behaves in the body and interacts with its receptor. So all of our amino acid-based hormones, these could be modified amino acids. Thyroid hormone, for example, is a modified amino acid. Well, it's two. We get two tyrosines and we stick them together and then we stick iodine on it. That iodine on it changes its solubility. So thyroid hormone is the one amino acid-based hormone that's going to behave like a steroid. Everything else is going to behave like an amino acid-based hormone. So be aware of that. Kind of put that in your back pocket. Modified amino acids are one type of amino acid-based. Peptides. That's just when you get a couple amino acids and stick them together. You'll see we have these epinephrine and norepinephrine released from your adrenal medulla, are catecholamines, amines, modified amino acid. So we've got some kind of modified amino acids or peptides, which is just a few, like 3 to 8 amino acids would be a peptide. And then when you get above that, we start calling them polypeptides, and then we can get to proteins. So anything that's going to be using an amino acid as its kind of base unit is going to be an amino acid-based hormone, and they tend to be water soluble. Most of them are. The only one that's not is thyroid hormone. We'll talk about that again in a minute. Steroids use cholesterol as their kind of basis. So based on that. Okay, so these are all based on cholesterol. And I'm just going to tell you right now, steroids only come from 2 places. 3. Gonads, testes and ovaries, that's why it's 3. Gonads is like 1 place. And then the adrenal cortex. So we're going to get into some nitty-gritty details, and there are a lot of hormones, and you have a lot to memorize. So whatever ways that we can chunk information together and make things easy, we're going to use it. So this is one. Be aware, steroids are only coming from 2 places in the body, the gonads and the adrenal cortex. So if you're looking at a hormone and you're trying to figure out its solubility, let's say, so amino acid based, except for thyroid hormone, are water soluble. Thyroid hormone comes down here for solubility and is lipid soluble. All of our steroids are lipid soluble, which means that steroids and thyroid hormone have to have a binding protein to be transported in the blood. All of these don't. They're water soluble. We haven't really talked a whole lot about any hormones yet, but if I were to say something to you like, the pancreatic hormone insulin, true or false? The pancreatic hormone insulin requires a transport protein in the blood. Okay. Well, you could actually probably figure that out right now, even though I was talking 100 miles an hour. Because I told you that these are lipid soluble, and these, so steroids and thyroid hormone require a transport protein in the blood. Everything else is amino acid based. So since I said it was a pancreatic hormone, it's coming from the pancreas, which means that it's water soluble and doesn't require a transport protein. So hopefully that'll all come together. Alright, so how do our hormones work? Well, what makes a target for a hormone is that it has receptors. So target cells contain receptors for specific hormones. So there aren't very many hormones that have receptors on every single cell in your body, but there are some. So every single cell in your body can respond to stress. So they've all got cortisol receptors. They just bind with different affinity. Every single cell in your body is going to be able to uptake glucose and use it. Insulin triggers that. So they've all got insulin receptors. Most of them have thyroid hormone receptors. But like some cells only have specific types of receptors. Your uterus, well, I mean, they're going to have those because they're part of all cells. But additionally, your uterus, let's say, the endometrium of your uterus will also have estrogen receptors and then progesterone receptors. But it's not going to have, like, your uterus isn't going to have testosterone receptors. So be aware of that. What makes a target cell a target is that it's got a receptor for a specific hormone. Okay? And so you might be, happy cell A, and you've got a thyroid hormone receptor, you've got a growth hormone receptor, you've got an insulin receptor, you've got whatever. So you have lots of receptors, and which hormones are bound at any given time is going to determine kind of what's going on in the cell. That thyroid hormone receptor should have been intracellular. We'll get there in just a second. Okay, we'll get there now. So our water-soluble hormones, how are they going to interact with their target cells? What is our cell membrane made of? A phospholipid bilayer, right? Can water-soluble substances just get through that bilayer? Absolutely not. It's what makes it a semipermeable membrane. So our water-soluble hormones can't just slip through our cell membrane. Let's imagine this is my phospholipid bilayer here. So in order to have an effect inside the cell, I have to bind an extracellular receptor. So just be aware of that. Water-soluble hormones require extracellular receptors at target cells. And that's because they can't slip through the plasma membrane. So if we look, if this is our phospholipid bilayer, and this is the inside of the cell, and this is the outside of the cell, you'll have this extracellular receptor, and it's got a 7 membrane spanning domain, and it's going to be associated with this thing called the G protein. This is a G protein coupled receptor. You should have had a basic introduction last semester, but if not, we'll have a basic introduction in a little bit. So, actually, maybe that's, no, there. Yes, we'll have an introduction in a little bit. So they require extracellular receptors. The other thing about water-soluble hormones is that they can be freely transported in the blood. They do not require a transport protein. So, these are freely transported in the blood, which means they do not require a transport protein. Okay, these water-soluble hormones are coming from everywhere except our gonads and the adrenal cortex, and then the thyroid produces thyroid hormone that is lipid soluble. So maybe just forget I just said that. Okay, lipid soluble hormones. These are not freely transported in the blood because blood is an aqueous substance, so these require a transport protein. And now these can slip through the cell membrane, which means that they have to bind to an intracellular receptor. So these use intracellular receptors. Extracellular receptors are also called G-protein coupled receptors, or GPCRs. And they've got an extracellular domain that's going to have our hormone receptor binding site. Then they have 7 transmembrane spanning domains. And they're associated with a G protein inside the cell. So when the hormone binds, that's the first messenger. And it's going to activate this G protein that's going to go off and activate a second protein in the cell membrane. So the most common second messenger pathway in the body is one called the cyclic AMP pathway. And the protein that gets activated up here then is one called adenylate cyclase. And adenylate cyclase is going to, when this G protein is activated and interacts with it, it's going to start kicking out this cyclic AMP. Or, yeah, cyclic AMP. CAMP, cyclic AMP. And this is the second messenger. And it's going to go on, and we're going to, as long as this adenylate cyclase is active, it's going to be kicking out cyclic AMP molecules. And cyclic AMP can then go turn on enzymes, or turn off other enzymes, or turn on gene transcription. So cyclic AMP is going to be able to cause a huge cascade of events inside the cell. Second messengers amplify the effect of the first messenger intracellularly. So an extracellular receptor is going to bind to the hormone its first message, and it will activate a second messenger pathway. The most common second messenger pathway is the cyclic AMP pathway that we just talked about. This is the G-stimulatory protein. So it would interact and activate adenylate cyclase. Adenylate cyclase kicks out cyclic AMP, which turns on enzymes, phosphorylase kinases primarily. That's what, like, the most commonly tested second messenger pathway. If you're taking an MCAT or something like that, you definitely want to know that in detail. But I would also recommend going over the IP3DAG pathway. That actually uses calcium as like a third messenger. It's pretty cool. So look over that one if you're going to be taking the MCAT. But for most nursing students, knowing the basics of the cyclic AMP pathway is enough. All right. So one of the cool things that can happen then when is that immediately we could, say, release another hormone in response to the binding of an extracellular receptor. And then we can also do a bunch of other stuff inside the cell. Intracellular receptors are a little more complicated. So these are going to be used by our lipid-soluble hormones, which are all of our steroids and thyroid hormone. Okay? So I didn't necessarily mention that back here. But let's do it. Let's make a list. Steroids and thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones, there are two, T3 and T4, we clump them together as thyroid hormone. Those are all of our lipid-soluble hormones. soluble. Steroids are only coming from where? The gonads and the adrenal cortex. Gonads release testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. The adrenal cortex releases aldosterone, our glucocorticoid, in us it's cortisol, and then adrenal androgens. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. So most of our hormones, by far, most of our hormones are water-soluble hormones that are going to be interacting with extracellular receptors, causing a second messenger cascade. Some of our hormones are lipid-soluble, which means that they are going to use an intracellular receptor. So intracellular receptors are more complicated than I believe your book goes over. I didn't even get into the nitty-gritty details of intracellular receptors until I was in graduate school, or a higher level endocrinology class at least. So when a lipid-soluble hormone is released to the blood, it's got to bind its transport protein. When it gets to its target, it's going to pop off that transport protein, slip through that plasma membrane, and it's got to go find its intracellular receptor. So it'll find it, it'll bind it, you actually have to have 2 of those dimerized, and then what's going to happen is this is going to slip through the nuclear envelope, and it's going to go in and cause a change in gene transcription. So we'll produce a new mRNA, which will come out and cause proteins to be synthesized, and we will change the structure of the cell. So if you think about, like the examples that I used, estrogen and testosterone, those cause big time changes in cells. So yeah, we could say our intracellular receptors are going to bind our lipid-soluble hormones. We could say that these enter the nucleus and change gene transcription. Okay? Good deal. Okay. Just a couple more things for today, and then I'll let you take a break. All right, so all of our endocrine glands are going to have to be responding to something. What? Some kind of stimulus. Well, where can we get various stimuli? Where do they come from? So when I'm asking about this, to what type of stimulus does the endocrine gland respond? I'm asking you, is it humoral, is it neural, or is it hormonal? And then specifically due to what? So humoral. Our body's humors are our body's fluids. So when an endocrine gland is responding to humoral stimulation, it's responding to the absence or presence of something in the blood. That's kind of weird to think about, but what we could say is that it's humoral stimulation of an endocrine gland occurs when that gland is paying attention to blood levels of something. So humoral stimuli, blood levels of something stimulate the gland or inhibit the gland if need be. If you're responding to the amount of something in the blood, it's humoral. What does this mean? Well, here's an example. Your pancreas is responding to blood glucose levels, and it can respond when blood glucose levels are high or when blood glucose levels are low. So the pancreas is responding humorally to blood glucose levels. If you have an increase in blood glucose, it will respond humorally and release insulin. Okay, so that's humoral stimulation. So we'll say, for example, blood glucose levels. Blood glucose levels regulate the pancreatic hormone secretion. Or, yeah. Okay, humoral. Something in the blood, or the lack of something in the blood, is causing the gland to respond. So what I just told you is if you get an increase in blood glucose, that your pancreas will respond and release insulin. If you get a drop in blood glucose, different cells in your pancreas are going to respond and release a hormone called glucagon. We'll talk more about that probably in our third endocrine lecture. All right, Neural stimulation is when a gland is directly responding to a neuron. So really there's only one good example of neural stimulation we'll talk about, and that you've already met when you talked about the sympathetic nervous system last semester and said that a target of the sympathetic nervous system was the adrenal medulla that's deep to the cortex and is releasing modified amino acids, epinephrine, and to a lesser degree, norepinephrine. So neural stimulation happens when a gland responds to a neuron. Or neural stimulation. And the example of this is the adrenal medulla is stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system, or SNS activation. Okay? All right. This is how a lot of our glands are going to work. Hormonal stimulation, where one hormone causes the gland to release another hormone. So one hormone stimulates a gland to release its hormone. So we'll see the anterior pituitary. This is an anterior pituitary, believe it or not. I know it looks like a nose or a mammary region, who knows, but it's an anterior pituitary. And this releases a bunch of hormones that are called trophic hormones. And they're going to go out and stimulate the production of most of our glands to release another hormone. So like thyroid stimulating hormone leaves and goes to the thyroid and causes it to release thyroid hormones that then feed back humorally, actually, on the hypothalamus to determine whether or not we're going to release more of that. We'll get there next class. So, okay, what's another example? We've got the gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, is going to stimulate the release of two gonadotropic hormones, FSH and LH. So this hormone is going to enter the blood and target the gonads and cause them to release our sex hormones. So one hormone, like our anterior pituitary is our master gland, and that's because it's releasing these hormones that are going out and controlling our other glands. This is where we'll pick up tomorrow everything I kind of drew there, but that was just to illustrate hormonal stimulation. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is what happens when you have a target cell that has receptors for multiple hormones, and those hormones are bound at the same time. You actually already learned about one way of interacting, hopefully last semester when you talked about the sympathetic nervous system and its effect on the adrenal gland, because when those hormones are released, they synergize with the sympathetic nervous system. So you've actually already met interactions, even though you don't necessarily know you've met interactions. In a permissive hormone interaction, what happens is the effects of one hormone are going to permit the effects of a second hormone. What the heck do you mean, lady? Well, let's talk about it. So the effects of one hormone at the target, at the specific target, permit the effects of a second hormone at the target. And a great example of this, and I'm actually going to draw probably a picture. This is the first time that I've done this, but I think it illustrates the point of how steroids work. Estrogen is high throughout the first part of the female reproductive cycle, up until ovulation. After ovulation, progesterone is going to go high. It's progestation. So if that ovulated oocyte gets fertilized, we've got a nice thick uterus that's ready for it. So estrogen, throughout the whole first half of the ovarian cycle, is upregulating progesterone receptors in the uterus so that it can permit the effect of progesterone when progesterone comes on board. So let's say that this cell right here is a uterine cell in this layer called the endometrium. We'll worry about that more when we get to the reproductive system. But this is a uterine cell, and it's got its estrogen receptor in here. And estrogen is a steroid, so it's got to be an intracellular receptor. Well then, when estrogen comes in here and binds, one of the things that it's going to do be uterine glands and grow more blood vessels. So estrogen is permitting the effect of progesterone. So that could be your example of a permissive effect. We could say, for example, estrogen increases progesterone receptors in the uterus. And you might be saying, lady, what is E2 and what is P4? The other thing that you have to learn when you're going through the endocrine system is called hormone nomenclature. You have to learn the abbreviations for all of these hormones. In us, our estrogen is something called estradiol, so it's abbreviated E2. So estrogen, I'm going to, for us, abbreviate E2. Its chemical name is estradiol. It's got two OH groups, that's why it's E2. Progesterone is P4. Okay? So, all right. Permissive effects. One hormone permits the effect of another hormone. Another thing, synergism. This is when the effects of two hormones in the system are over and above additive. So when two hormones are present on a target cell, they're going to synergize, will amplify the response. So in synergism, when both hormones are bound, or all, there could be more than one. If you've got growth hormone, testosterone, and thyroid hormone in the same cell, you're going to have a lot of growth. So when both or all hormones are bound, the response is amplified above and beyond additive. So, for example, growth hormone causes growth. Testosterone causes growth. That's not what I meant to say. I meant to say thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone also causes growth. It increases metabolism. So if you're growing and you have thyroid hormone on board, you're going to grow even more. So that's what's happening in synergism. So we'll just say that for our example. Growth hormone causes growth. Thyroid hormone increases metabolism. So if you get growth hormone plus thyroid hormone, you get an increase in growth, but greater than would be expected if you just had one on its own. Throw testosterone in there and you get even a lot more. So this is just arbitrary numbers to illustrate a point. But let's say that testosterone on its own causes 1 unit of growth. And growth hormone on its own causes 1 unit of growth. Well, if you have a target cell that has both testosterone and growth hormone bound at the same time, instead of getting just 2 units of growth, you'll get 3 units of growth. Okay? So synergism is when our hormones interact and the response is greater than additive. Okay, antagonism, you don't see, like, there wouldn't naturally be a situation where you've got antagonistic hormones being dumped in high quantities at the same time. It just doesn't happen because antagonists have exactly the opposite effect. So in that blood glucose loop I was talking about, insulin is going to cause the blood glucose to drop by causing all of your cells to take up that glucose. Its antagonist is one called glucagon, and it's released when your blood glucose goes low. So it's going to cause your liver to release its stored glucose and increase blood glucose. Those are antagonistic effects. These are opposite effects. So antagonism is when hormones have the opposite effects at target tissues. And actually, you probably met one of these last year when you were talking, or last semester when you were talking about bone. Parathyroid hormone and calcitonin are antagonists at bone. Parathyroid hormone stimulates bone resorption. Calcitonin stimulates bone deposition. They are antagonists, okay, at that tissue. I mean, I guess they have different target cells. They're antagonists at the tissue. If I was thinking about an antagonist at a cell, like if I was looking in my liver, my hepatocytes, they're going to be storing my glucose as glycogen. So when I have high glucose, insulin would stimulate glycogenesis. I would make it. When I've got low blood glucose, I could target my hepatocyte. Glucagon would bind and cause us to break that down, glycogenolysis, and release it. So antagonists. Opposite effects. Woo-wee! All right, so tomorrow we're going to pick up with the hypothalamus and pituitary. And this will probably be all we talk about in the second endocrine lecture, because it's a lot. And we're actually going to review kind of everything from the third as we go through it. Repetition breeds success. So have a look over at least the figures and captions in your book for hypothalamus and pituitary in the tables. And that'll be a good place for you to be mentally prepared for tomorrow. See you then.